Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the annual public lecture of the Ruli House. My name is Nihan Akgelken. I'm an associate professor in sustainable urban development. I'm also the director of the research within the department. Today, I'm very pleased to be welcoming Professor Yasmin Khan, the professor of modern history in our department, the Department for Continuing Education. Yasmin is a historian, and she specializes in the British imperial history, particularly the British in India, South Asian decolonization, refugees, and aftermath of empire. Well, she has authored several papers and books, and she is the recipient of the Gladstone Prize from the Royal Historical Society with her book, The Great Partition, The Making of India and Pakistan, which was published by the Yale University in 2007. Well, academia is not the only medium that Yasmin engages in her work. So she is also known for her work on television, presenting shows like A Passage to Britain and Back in Time for Birmingham. She has also written novels, Edgware Road and Overland. And I can say Edgware Road is one of my favorite novels, Yasmin. So we are very, very pleased to have Yasmin here today, as she will discuss the British imperial way of warfare by bringing the perspective of the Asian non-combatants and the camp followers in the 19th and 20th centuries. This work is in progress, which she is currently working. It's going to be published as a monograph. So Yasmin, we will have 45 minutes for the talk and 10-15 minutes for the Q&A. And I know that we have tens of people watching online currently as well. So we'll have questions from the online chat as well. And at the end of the seminar, we will have drinks next door, but I'm going to give you the instructions later on to keep you here for the whole hour. So thank you very much, Yasmin. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Nihan, and thank you to everybody in the department who have helped to organise this lecture this evening, to David Graham and to the marketing team and everybody else. And thank you all for attending. Good afternoon, everyone. It's really good to give a lecture on my home turf, which is very much the Department for Continuing Education, where I've been for, well, over a decade now. So my subject this afternoon is war, and specifically the wars that Britain was engaged in and waged in the later half of the 19th century. Despite the Victorian projection of Pax Britannica and the narrative of peace delivered in the place of warring pre-colonial factions in the world, nearly every year from 1857 to 2021, Britain was engaged somewhere in the world in conflict. In South Africa, in Afghanistan, in Malaya, in the Middle East. Even today, Britain's military has a permanent presence at 145 base sites in 42 countries. So this history of warfare transcends years of formal empire and decolonisation and goes well beyond the world wars of the 20th century. It covers territories where formal imperial control was never established. In fact, one problem with this book project that I'm working on is that it's just not possible to cover all the conflicts in which Britain was involved since 1857. There's over 100. Yet despite this fact, our understanding of Britain's role in wars often appears a bit parochial perhaps, or bounded by the nation state. So today I want to ask a fundamental question. Why, despite much excellent new work on non-European armies, and in particular the use of Black and Asian troops in the British military, can these still feel strangely detached and not fully integrated into our histories? Why does military history often feel like it's still led from the front by the white British male soldier? And I will be arguing today that British imperialism depended absolutely on non-European soldiery. The whole imperial system was intrinsically linked to the deployment of non-European manpower, not only as soldiers, but also as Lascars, merchant seamen, as non-combatants, and it couldn't have been sustained or existed without this manpower. So embedding these histories in longer imperial histories becomes, writing military histories of Britain without embedding in these longer imperial histories becomes harder to sustain. And I think I'm not the only person saying this. So to write military histories of Britain without this imperial scaffolding is becoming increasingly untenable. British military power, like British imperialism itself, depended on non-European manpower as soldiers, sailors, Lascars, porters, and non-combatants. And I'm not alone in saying this. There's been historiographical advances in the understanding of this development in historical literature, not least by colleagues and students in the Oxford History Faculty, but also by students in this department. And I'll use this lecture today to highlight some of these contributions. Also to discuss how I'm developing and working on these insights in my own work. So this lecture is both a synthesis and a broad public synthesis of work, but also includes some deep dives into my own archival work. And there's several important works here that I'd flag. There's a lot of work that's been done on Chinese workers in the Great War. Shantanu Das, who's based at All Souls, wrote this important book on Indians in the First World War and First World War culture. Radhika Singh, who's based in Delhi, wrote about the Coolies' Great War, Indian labour in a global conflict. Kevin Knowles, who started in this department on the postgraduate certificate in history and completed a doctorate a few years ago here, has published recently Indian Prisoners of War in Japanese Captivity during World War II. And Rob Johnson, who's also based in Oxford, has written about Indigenous personnel in Western Armed Forces. So there's been a whole flourishing of new and important words. Let me turn to this striking visual image. You might be familiar with this Second World War propaganda poster currently on display at the Imperial War Museum. And it shows 7 military personnel from across the British Empire, African, Indian, British, Canadian, and New Zealander, Australian, and Royal Navy, marching shoulder to shoulder beneath a Union Jack. Today, I think we spot quite quickly the relative sizes and placements of the figures, which jar with modern sensibilities. But in the 1940s, this poster was a powerful symbol of imperial unity, especially at a moment of British isolation in the war. It was an aspiration towards an imagined imperial togetherness. Historians like Wendy Webster, Sonia Rose, and Nico Slate have shown how wartime mobilization created new cosmopolitan contact zones in London, in Burma, in North Africa, where soldiers from across the empire interacted. These encounters could be cosmopolitan and solidaristic, but they were also frequently marked by racial tension, by hierarchies, by mutual suspicion, not least in London itself. These thicker social histories, which explain how and why non-Europeans came to be in service in Britain, are somewhat elided by the superficiality of this image. Shantanu Das has shown how the words and images of sepoys themselves can be passed to give them voice and equivalence, and give them equivalence to the European. And behind each uniform figure, whether Indian or West African, lie complex social histories of caste, class, kinship, of specific local histories. And the marching soldier tells us only little about the structures of recruitment, the economic pressures, or the coercive systems that brought us there. But I want to go back in time to the 19th century. A lot of this newer work focuses on the 20th, understandably, because for very good reasons, the numbers were just so much greater in the First and Second World Wars, culminating in that great volunteer army, the Indian Army, of 2.3 million men in the Second World War, which I've written about myself. But if we go back in time to before the First World War, to the 19th century, it's possible to trace the lineages of this to great networks of interaction, translocal, transnational contact occasioned by war and making war, which brought non-European armies, specifically the Indian Army, the Indian sepoys, into action across the world. And you can see here all these places, Burma, Afghanistan, China, the Mediterranean, Egypt, Sudan, North Africa, East Africa. These great networks of interaction. Seen in this light, the 19th century becomes a great web of military actions, where people were being moved across vast spaces to enact violence against one another. And once we take out the national framing of war, it becomes a more interesting and complex beast. And this leveraging of this labour is at the heart of how I see the Victorian Empire and what I will concentrate on today. So rather than simply sticking to the national frame, my suggestion is to make sure that non-European soldiers and camp followers are understood as part of great transnational flows and networks. And Indian here, we can't avoid using collective nouns, but it becomes a shorthand for regions that later became Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, but clearly sort of bisected by lots of different linguistic and caste and regional differences. So the first time Indian troops were sent abroad was not 1914, but 1762, when soldiers from the Madras Army were dispatched to Manila. This is a picture of Indian Army troops en route to Sudan in 1884. Older company and pre-colonial traditions that I can't fully integrate into this lecture here in this time today were part of this two-way traffic of military knowledge and understanding on which the British drew and learned, as well as bringing their own arms and strategies from the 18th century pre-colonial and company armies. But the first Indian deployment to Europe came in 1878, when Britain sent troops to Malta and then to Cyprus during the Russo-Turkish crisis. This wasn't a war per se, war didn't actually erupt at that point, but it was a moment of high militarism and patriotic fervour. This moment, although ultimately not a moment of war, created a sort of surge in jingoism in Britain as war with Russia seemed likely. As one correspondent reported in 1878, rumours were rife and the music halls also contributed with a popular song. "We don't want to fight, but by jingo, if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too." The use of Indian troops was watched carefully from Britain and not without some apprehension and debate. This wasn't about the quality of the troops themselves and the trust deficit, as it's been described after the 1857 uprising. Some people were worried that they'd be disloyal and about a fear of renewed rebellion. But it was really a consternation about Britain using imperial troops too extensively for war making itself, which came particularly from a liberal faction. It was used as a moment of both propaganda and a visual statement of empire, and the entwining of visual claim making with other military forms of powers is quite clear in this case. In Malta, the presence of the Indian soldiers was both a real strategic benefit, but also used to bolster a patriotic imperial pride. They were inspected by senior royals, including the Prince of Wales and the Duke of Cambridge. One thing that's interesting to me in this engraving is you can see some of the camp followers. In the middle, there's the water carrier, the Camp Bisley, and there's a halt for Pani. There's a place where a group are taking water. So I'll return to non-combatants in a bit, but you can see them here in this image. To give you a sense of the scale, the Malta Expeditionary Force included over 5,500 Indian soldiers, along with more than, nearly 2,500 camp followers, over 1,000 horses and ponies, and dozens of bullocks, just with a few hundred European officers. In 1878, these Indian troops were dispatched onwards to Cyprus in preparation for the British occupation of that island. And that group included Madras sappers and miners who went in an advance party and carried out construction and military building, as well as roadworks, as Britain took over the colony from the Ottomans. And here they are, looking remarkably interchangeable with other forms of manual labour. So this role in logistics and infrastructure of the military personnel is something I'll return to later in this lecture. In Malta and in Cyprus, there was a lot of curiosity about these Indians who had come. An artist called Giuseppe Cali painted portraits, and local Maltese people still talk about how some of the Indians, particularly some of the camp followers, stayed on locally. But beneath this interesting human story of movement and interaction is the sheer power of a mobile, flexible army at the disposal of Britain. This sparked constitutional debate back in London. Members of Parliament questioned whether it was lawful or even ethical to deploy Indian troops for European defence. Concerns were raised that the Crown was assembling a shadow army outside of parliamentary control. Yet in the end, the logic of empire prevailed, and the manpower was simply too useful, too available, and critically, too cheap to resist. The year before the Malta dispatch, there had been similar questions raised about the sending of Sikhs to New Zealand. And this is a quote from William Forster, a Liberal MP. It appeared that by little and little, the Crown was getting the disposal of a much larger force than was voted by Parliament. And it was highly important that the relations in which we stood to the Indian Army should, in this respect, be clearly established and understood. The precise number of men of which the army was to consist was annually voted by the House. But if they permitted the employment, without remark, of Indian troops out of India, the result would be to place at the disposal of the Crown an army of 100,000 or 200,000 men beyond the force directly sanctioned by the House. And for context, the British Army averaged about 200,000 men throughout the 19th century. So what we're seeing here is an objection to the kind of the remit of the use of Indian troops going beyond what people felt that had been sanctioned or discussed by Parliament. In the end, the Indophiles won out, or perhaps these great reserves of skilled, trained manpower were just too irresistible. The costs were passed to the Indian peasant cultivator and taxpayer. The Indian taxpayer, particularly the peasant cultivator, bore the cost of these expeditions. In fact, the entire British imperial defence strategy was built around Indian revenue. As South Asian historians know well, this created a self-serving fiscal logic whereby Britain could wage war globally while keeping domestic defence spending really low, hovering at about just 3% through much of the 19th century. By the 1930s, as late as 17 years before independence, over 60% of the government of India's revenue was spent on the military. So this isn't just a footnote, it's central to understanding how the empire functioned. And this wasn't just unique to India, as Richard Reid notes in The African Revolution, another colleague at Oxford. British campaigns in Africa also relied almost entirely on local manpower. European soldiers were only sparingly deployed. Instead, British success hinged on African soldiers, guides, and logistics, people with deep knowledge of terrain and climate. And he writes, in only a handful of cases were substantial bodies of European soldiers deployed on African soil. Reid also points, as in India, to traditions of martial races invented and perpetuated by colonial rulers, but also to the pre-colonial histories of traditions of warfare and martiality, where people deeply affected by political upheaval and economic transformation were drawn into mercenary service. The medical history of this strand is important, and I will mention here David Gork-Roger, who was a postgraduate MST student, also came through the postgraduate certificate in history in this department, who recently completed his doctorate on the health of the Indian armies. So what does all of this amount to? Well, we need to fundamentally rethink the idea of how, I think I'm sort of trying to invert the way that Britain conquered the world with the idea of Britain conquering the world with British soldiers. Just as India served as a reservoir for indentured labour on plantations, it also provided migrant military labour readily deployable along land and sea routes to meet the empire's strategic needs. But what about the sea, I hear you ask? What about the navy? So for centuries, the British Empire ruled not only by land, but by sea. And central to its maritime dominance was a group of men whose stories have largely faded from mainstream historical narratives, the Lascars. These sailors, drawn from across the Indian subcontinent, but also the Arab world, East Africa, Southeast Asia, were the backbone of Britain's merchant fleet, essential to global trade, war efforts, and the very functioning of the empire. The word Lascar is derived from the Persian lashkar, meaning army or camp, and it entered European usage via the Portuguese. And again, this wasn't a single ethnic group, drawn from a very wide geographical area, from Bengal, Gujarat, from the Malay archipelago. Many were Muslim, but there were also Hindu, Christian, and Buddhist Lascars on European ships. But what united them was their shared experience of maritime labour under imperial regimes. They were recruited in colonial port cities, often through contracts, and placed in grueling jobs on board. And these jobs became particularly important and also sort of punishing, I suppose, after the change to steam. Because with the advent of steam-powered liners and the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869, Lascar labour became even more vital. Working in engine rooms, in particular, coal stoking, was really hot, dangerous, dirty work. And Lascars were wrongly assumed to be biologically better suited for such conditions. Again, I'm the beneficiary of a really rich historiography around this. And some of this has really come from community-based historians who traced back the roots of Bangladeshis, for instance, in areas like Brick Lane, and wrote about the histories of Lascars from localities in Britain, scholars such as Rosina Visram and Caroline Adams. Although for much of the 20th century, Lascars were ignored in official histories, partly because there's so little documentary evidence about them or from them in their own voices, and I will come to that. One interesting aspect is how much of what I've talked about today was a world which didn't include the Atlantic side of the British Empire. But again, because of climate, Lascars were considered to not be suitable for routes between Britain and the Americas. And there was a climate clause in many of their agreements preventing deployment in regions like the North Atlantic due to concerns about their health and working capacity in such environments. There's a sort of environmental determinism. But in 1917, due to labour shortages, the British government waived restrictions and allowed Lascars to be employed on North Atlantic routes, despite their prior contractual and regulatory limits. And this decision marked a significant shift in imperial labour practices, highlighting once again the wartime dependency on colonial labour forces. The 1910 parliamentary report on Lascar conditions starkly illustrates the racial hierarchy aboard ships. Lascars received a fraction of white sailors' wages, often 8 or 9 shillings a week, were housed in cramped quarters below deck. And I've got a better statistic, actually. At the end of the Second World War, their monthly pay was about £1.17 compared to £9.12 for Europeans. So it's considerably less. Under Lascar agreements, these men could not leave ships freely at British ports, were often confined to ships' premises, or sent back to India on the next available vessel. The Asiatic Articles of Employment stipulated that Lascars could only be discharged in Indian ports, effectively preventing them from settling in more prosperous regions. Additionally, British colonial policies such as the Coloured Alien Seamen's Order of 1925 were designed to control the movement of non-European sailors, further limiting their opportunities. But many of them did jump ship, use their time in ports to trade on the side, and made calculations about where their wages were best and where money could be made. By 1938, just over a quarter of merchant seamen on British vessels were Indian, and Nye Bevan, the British Labour politician, described them as cheap human fodder. British and Asian labour activists actually sort of united and perceived their cause by the mid-20th century. And in the Second World War, there were many strikes and protests, which led to increased wages and were kind of partially successful. Now, I've mentioned first-hand accounts. How do we hear or know what these soldiers and sailors experienced? And that is a really big problem. Partly because of the way that war is memorialized, partly because of the fact that sometimes, I mean, Lascars in particular, often had jumped ship and therefore didn't want to record or even give accounts even later into the 20th century about their earlier lives. It's also a question of censorship. So the way that we hear the records come in fragments often, or through some personal first-hand accounts, but far, far different. There's a real imbalance in sources compared to when we look at, say, European military histories or war histories. But there are accounts of Lascars or interviews that were taken. For instance, Caroline Adams interviewed Shah Abdul Majid Qureshi in the 1980s. And he said, "I was called a bunker man in the coal bunker. It was hot. Oh, yes, it was hot. We put coal in the boiler and then it got hot and the ship runs. It's a very difficult job, very hard. In my sea life, I knew hundreds of people who died." And that actually does relate to an issue around statistics and casualties as well, which is, I will come to, but it's really complicated too. One first-hand account also included in Caroline Adams's book, which I find very intriguing, is about Nawab Ali, and tells his life story. He was illiterate and unable to read and write. He was born in 1922. Both his parents died on the same day from a disease when he was a baby. He ran away from home to join a boat crew as a child, and he knew how to sort of operate local rivercraft in that area that is now Bangladesh. He knew how to navigate rivers, mend boats, test depths of waters. And then he was recruited onto a steamship. He worked in a boiler room, again, sort of hot and dangerous and dirty, and did day and night shifts to keep the boiler going. And he arrived in Britain in 1939, just 4 days before the Second World War. He left his ship in Cardiff and became a runaway, living on the streets. And he worked in jobs in restaurants, cafes, hotels, washing dishes and peeling potatoes. And then he finally went back to sea. He became a gunner on a ship's tower, but on a merchant ship, and went into the Mediterranean, which was under German and Italian control. And he was unlucky to be in the Bay of Naples at a place called Bari, which is where one of the most disastrous attacks of the whole conflict occurred on ships. 28 merchant ships laden with cargo and ammunition were either sunk or destroyed in that attack, with 2,000 killed. After that, he settled in the East End of London and ran a halal butcher shop and a cafe, and was something of a pioneer. He helped other settlers and migrants in that area that's now Brick Lane, and became a sort of proponent of plurality and of multiculturalism. And I think what we see through his story are some of the themes that I've been trying to bring out, the way that military and non-military histories and life histories are entwined and entangled, but also that these are complicated lives, peripatetic, not straightforwardly enlisted in the military, but often moving in and out of it, or trying to use the service as a way of actually gaining leverage in other ways. So in the Second World War, an estimated 250,000 Lascars served in the British Merchant Navy, comprising around 1/6 of its personnel. And they manned convoys through the Atlantic, through the Arctic routes, and the Indian Ocean, delivering vital supplies to Britain and its allies. One notorious incident during the Second World War was the case of this SS City of Benares. You might have come across it, which was a ship which was torpedoed tragically while evacuating children to Canada. 77 British children, some as young as 5 or 6, died in 1940 in that tragedy, which stunned the empire. But there were also 160 Lascars on board, and 101 of them died or drowned. Many had no surname, we don't know their date of birth, people like Soria, the apprentice, or Mubarak Ali, a baker. One 22-year-old called Abbas Baku, who was from Maharashtra, central India, managed to get on a lifeboat and spent 8 days on it and survived and got to Scotland, but died shortly afterwards, and his grave is still there in Greenock. Yusuf Chowdhury, a child in Sylhet at the time, remembered, as the news came, the dead seaman's relatives and friends would gather and begin shouting and crying. Soon the bad news spread from house to house, village to village. The people became nervous, worrying that they would be next in line. The British public didn't hear the cry of the seamen's widows. Now, in this case, with the SS City of Benares, the ship was crewed largely by Lascars, who were criticised for being unsuited to the cold Atlantic, and this was raised in Parliament. Robert Gibson, a Scottish MP, asked in Parliament, "Is the minister aware that there's a great deal of concern in various parts of the country because Lascars are obviously not suited to cold North Atlantic winds?" So there's sort of slightly element of scapegoating going on. And the Undersecretary of State for Dominion Affairs was asked who was responsible for manning the city of Benares by Lascars. But official records defended their performance and reaffirmed their professionalism. Now, as I've mentioned, far from passive victims, Lascars repeatedly resisted. One major site of resistance was a seamen's strike in London and Liverpool, where they joined forces with Caribbean and African sailors to demand equal pay and better food. And there were lots of organised activism actually throughout, particularly in the 1930s and 1940s, among Lascars in Britain and in India itself, in Liverpool, in Alexandria, in Port Said, in ports all around the empire. In Cape Town, in Burma, in Australia. And actually British public reactions were also could be very sympathetic. In Liverpool, the local superintendent refused to arrest 83 men who were on strike. And an Indian Comforts Fund was set up with British women knitting scarves, balaclavas, and giving food parcels out. One striking thing when you look at the documents about the Lascars is how concerned they were for their families back home. And many of them, some of the things that they were protesting for, as well as better pay and soap and better clothing, were for guarantees that money would be remitted to their families in the instance that they were killed. So the Lascar seamen strikes actually feature among the earliest organised labour movements in the UK involving non-European workers. And their pivotal role in both the maritime industry and the broader struggle for workers' rights, I think, is just still kind of emergent. So the last section of this lecture just thinks about camp followers more broadly, and those people who accompanied fighting men. And you can see in this much earlier print, which is from the National Army Museum, a line of Bengal infantry in Sindh, and there's probably too tiny to see, but on the left-hand side, there's a coolie, and you can see women and children who were accompanying as camp followers. So regimental or camp followers included women and children. And they included all kinds of kulikor, laborers, sutlers, chogiwallahs, and they include people doing all sorts of jobs, like dhobi, washermen, cooks, sweepers, grass cutters, laborers doing construction work, grooms, cobblers, smiths, water carriers, tea makers, small shopkeepers, people doing credit and money lending, ironing, pressing, and selling illicit substances. Radhika Singha has pointed to this grey zone, again, between non-combatants and combatants, and the extent of service of these families, and the fuzzy intersection with labour histories, the bazaar and the cantonment were coming into contact. Attached followers were assigned to regiments or other formations as cooks, sweepers, water carriers, and laundry people. So they were sort of not formal members of the military, they were just attached. Whereas there were actual coolie corps for things like porterage, road building, and they were semi-permanent in some locations. And there was an overlap in the recruiting pools between soldiers and the non-combatants and the followers, the private followers also, who were often funded through mess funds, subscriptions, deductions from officer wages for barbers, servants, mess waiters, washermen. So you have this whole kind of group, often half this sort of, for every 1,000 men going to war, you get about another 500 who are going as camp followers. Huge groups, very different to the relationship with, say, in the British Army. And it meant the Indian Army was actually one of the few places, India was one of the few places where even rank and file British soldiers had their own servants. I think this is another thing that I sort of point to is this blurriness of this labour force, the fact that this is not just the Indian Army, but kind of something which sort of segues into other kinds of labour too. So I'm going to draw towards the end with a particular case study that I've followed in the archives of a man who does exactly this, who transcends camp followers, soldiering, and sea crossing. And his name was Jumah Khan. Jumah Khan was born in Kabul sometime in the mid-19th century. He described himself as a northern Indian born in Kabul. And a Muslim, he seems to have made his way down to the Punjab plains for employment. At least that's where he was recruited in 1874 by a British soldier explorer called Captain Speedy. Tristram Speedy is worth a digression because he was an Orientalist and a maverick soldier and an all-round sort of hard man for the empire. And he'd been born in Meerut in India, and he'd already fought in India in 1857 in the uprising, in New Zealand, and he'd been part of a brutal campaign in Abyssinia. And he was in India in 1874 on a very specific and private mission, which was that he'd been paid by a ruler in Malaya, to pick up and round up some suitable fighting men and to recruit them on the behalf of this Malay kingdom and to take them to fight in what are called the Larut Wars. And Speedy himself was being paid about £35,000 for this task. So what did men like Jumah Khan themselves know about this employment or what it would involve? Well, it seems that there was general confusion in Punjab about what they were being recruited for. Local police reports agreed that the men who were being recruited by Speedy were unsure of where they were being sent. Many were under the misapprehension that they were being sent as guards to the Andaman Islands. Many deserted on their way to Calcutta before boarding the ship, and only half of the men recruited actually sailed. The men Speedy picked up in 2 days were described as chiefly from Wazirabad and Gujranwala districts, Pathans and hill tribesmen. And the local magistrate said, there are numbers of men willing enough to go beyond the sea with prospect of good pay. He also noted that these men were tough. Most of his men are Pathans, fit for soldiers rather than police only. So the reason they chose to go along was the wages being offered. Speed himself was very clear about what he wanted, a fighting sort of man, not from the towns, but from the villages. And interestingly, this sort of renegade action, this collection of men for private enlistment, pushed the government into state control of private armies. And they shortly passed a law in British India banning the enlistment of men for private armies of foreign powers. So Jumah Khan is sort of stuck at the crossroads of all these different forces. And we know from records that are in the National Archives in Malaysia that he stuck it out. He went across the ocean on a ship and made it to Malaya, where he spent the next 37 years of his life. And he's unusual because it's tricky to find a man without rank or status in these kind of historical files, but he made some later pension claims and got recommended for a medal. So I could see his career. He was part of this unregulated, non-governmental, essentially private army, which morphed over time into the Perak Armed Police, which is the forerunner of the Malaysian police force. And we can see through these documents also his checkered career. And when he was recommended for an Imperial Service Medal in 1911, one of the recommendations said, "It's impossible to overestimate the value this man has been to the state. In the early days, he did everything from drilling the gunners and repairing arms to haircutting, butcher, and milk supplier. There is nothing he cannot do, and he does everything well." I'm going to divert back a bit to Speedy because in his mission in Abyssinia, because that again, and in 1868, this invasion, well, the sort of takeover of Abyssinia involved 13,000 British and Indian soldiers, 8,000 auxiliaries, included 36,000 animals, horses, mules, bullocks, camels, and 44 elephants. 291 ships were taken from India, but also from Britain and Aden. So Speedy had been involved in that campaign. And actually, you may have heard of the Egyptian king, the Ethiopian king Tewodros, whose son was taken as a small child back to Queen Victoria. I don't know if you've come across that. There's been a campaign in the press. Some people were talking about repatriating the bones of this poor child who died and is actually interred in Windsor Castle. Anyway, Speedy was the caretaker for this child and took him to India as well. So it's almost possible that Jumah Khan would have even encountered Tewodros as child. And I think this sort of, again, speaks to these strange interconnections in this global picture, which can't just be framed by thinking about the Indian Army as a discrete mobile force. Back to Jumah Khan. I think he might be in this photo, but we don't know. But Captain Speedy is there right in the middle, and the tall man with the beard. We know that he earned a pension, Jumah Khan, in 1890. But he wrote himself that he'd unfortunately commuted it. So he cashed it in because he thought he would be able to trade with the amount. But times being bad, your petitioner found he could not earn sufficient by his trade. So he basically tried to break away to do something by himself, become a merchant or trade some things, and it didn't work out. So then he got himself re-employed as an armourer in 1892. And was retained as an assistant armourer to the Malay States Guides after that. So once we go beyond the idea of the Indian soldier that I showed you at the beginning in the Second World War poster, and conceive instead of the British Empire as networked by this great military labour system, I think the centrality of the Indian Army, but also camp followers, non-combatants, Lascars, all starts to kind of come into view. And I would stress that this was a mutual enterprise, that there was a lot of pivotal decision-making and the exercise of agency and opportunism by South Asians themselves, in the way, for instance, they moved in and out of state employ. And the rulers were able to insert themselves pivotally into political systems to extract and leverage this labour. So it's not European boots on the ground. It's only by placing these soldiers and their social worlds within longer, deeper imperial histories that we can begin to understand their significance. So as much as I'm an advocate for celebrating Indian contributions or Sikh contributions or Gurkha contributions to the Second World War, I think that does also risk sort of eliding some of this history and cordoning off and siloing the experience of war in sort of national or ethnic boxes, and it misses this much longer lineage. There's another important question, which is what does it mean to envisage that the majority of colonial violence or brutality was carried out by colonized peoples themselves against each other? And this isn't to elide, but to complicate the place of race in the history of imperialism. So I think the history of imperial warfare tells us many things: how power works through hegemony, how people are pitted against each other in those processes of imperialism. And these are much more subtle and complex interactions than simple racial binaries permit, or than thinner descriptions of imperialism allow. So we should complicate this history using lens of capital extraction, class difference, and the power of ideology to coerce and form the imperial world. If nothing else, these stories are a reminder of how far we have to go to upend the normative ideas of Victorian peace, prosperity, and progress, which still shape many of our understandings of the British past. Thank you.
Thank you for the fantastic talk, Yasmin. So now we have time for questions.
Hi, Yasmin, thank you. As this work progresses, will you be considering the entry of non-European officers into the British Army?
Very possibly. I mean, it's much later. It only really starts to happen in the interwar period after the First World War. So at the moment, I'm just focusing on the 19th century mostly. But I think it would be really interesting to look at some of those non-European officers, and particularly the ones who come to Sandhurst and are trained in Britain themselves. I mean, the problem with this project is that there's just so many different stories. There's so many different angles that could go off.
Hi. You showed a picture of an Indian officer in the Indian Army, but there were many British officers in the Indian Army, and I wondered what proportion were British, and also were there any British ordinary soldiers in the Indian Army?
So the ordinary soldiers were in the British Army, but they were deployed to...
As opposed to the officers?
Yeah, so ordinary rank and file British soldiers were sent to India.
You could be a British soldier in the Indian Army.
You couldn't be a rank and file British soldier in the Indian Army.
You couldn't. No.
You could be in the British Army and in India.
Because I knew somebody who was an Indian Army general, but he was British.
Yeah, they could be in the officer ranks, but they couldn't be a rank and file. They couldn't be an ordinary soldier.
Right.
Like ordinary Tommies weren't. Having said that, there could have been people who were mixed race or Anglo-Indian who were sort of fell in between the two. And what proportion?
Were the officers Indian or British?
So the officers were all British, European, all the way through until the interwar period. And then there's this process called Indianization, where they start to gradually increase Indian officers.
But you showed the picture was back in the 18th or 19th century of this Indian Army officer.
I don't think he couldn't have been an officer. I mean, he must have been a sort of, there were ranks. There were people who were more junior, but the senior officers were all European.
Okay.
And gradually, until into the Second World War, you start to see predominance of Indian officers, but it's really late.
Hi, I think you've got a series of books here, not a monograph. But just to ask you about one small aspect, and that's the Lascars. They're not entirely invisible in British history because they start to appear in the census data, which is now available online, and particularly not so much the Brick Lane area, but certainly down in Limehouse, in that multicultural area, which was a small Chinatown. But you do get people, and they are listed as a profession, Lascar.
Oh, that's a really good tip. Thank you.
What I did want to ask you, though, is about these Lascars again. It's a technical question in a way. They're obviously kind of regulated just like British seamen. Now, if you go to the Board of Trade Records in Kew, you'll find lovely lovely records for every individual sailor, including a photograph of them. It's fascinating to see what ships they were on and when. Is there any similar records from the Indian side, or were these regulated by the Board of Trade in London?
They weren't regulated by the Board of Trade in London, and they're recruited locally. So there are lists, like crew lists, and there's a project called Crew List.
Yeah.
Crew list project, do you know that?
Yeah.
And they're trying to kind of amalgamate all the different types of crew lists that they can find from around the world. So you can search by name in that and by ship, and you can find individual Lascars, but it's not complete.
No,
it's not a complete picture.
I'm just, I'm curious whether this Mr. Khan actually received, he was nominated for the Order of Merit. Did he receive it?
I don't know, because the trouble with some of these records is I lost him. You know, you see him, and I never found out whether he actually got this medal. But I suspect he probably did. And it looked like they were, actually, and it was kind of interesting because it looked like they were looking after him. They kept kind of giving him jobs. He was obviously quite elderly by that point, and they kept him on as with this armourer role, which it looked as if he'd almost was being looked after by the regiment rather than being sort of forgotten. And the papers were very warm about it.
I thought that the point you made about Parliament's concern about the use of the Indian Army without, as it were, their complete control over what was going on in the government's use of armed force in various conflicts. Was that a problem that went on? Did it grumble on? And how was it ever resolved? Or was it just a sort of British fudge and everybody just forgot about it in the end?
Yeah, it's the latter. It's a fudge. So the kind of rubric, if you like, is always that the Indian Army is to be used for imperial defence.
Right.
And defence primarily of the Indian Empire. But that can kind of stretch quite far in certain sorts of ways. I mean, why not then send them to Singapore or Hong Kong because they'd be defending the Indian Empire? So it was a fudge, but the money side, that became very controversial in the Second World War. It's only in the Second World War that there's a deal made that Britain will pay for the use of Indian troops, and Churchill was very, very exercised about it, and there was a transfer made, but that's the only point at which it's kind of balanced it. Yeah.
So is there a paper trail in Hansard of this argument or discussion?
Well, you have to pick it up at different points, but it seems. I mean, I think the high point of that is the bit that I showed in the 1880s, where there's still, you get around that time. Yeah. There's still around Gladstone and the Liberals. There's still kind of a lot of kind of consternation about imperialism more generally and what's Britain doing in the world. And once you get into sort of 1900, that falls away a bit and kind of becomes more of a consensus around.
Thank you. Well, thanks for taking on such a big project, and I'm sure we're all looking forward to the book. I was really fortunate to work at another university with an enthusiast for this topic, David Amissi, and I wondered if you could say something about the kind of longer historiography of the topic.
Yeah, sure. No, I know David Amissi, and he was in Oxford last term, gave a paper, and is writing a book about India in the Second World War. So David's work was about soldiers' letters from the First World War. And in particular, because I didn't go into it, but it's really hard to find those voices and find that agency and to hear the voices of these soldiers. But one really valuable source is in the British Library, and it's censored letters that were sort of taken by the censor from soldiers who were writing home. And they would take extracts as a way of thinking about the mood of the army and analysing morale, and also seeing what was going on. And they're really rich and really detailed, but they are extracted, they are translated, they're not in the original handwriting or in the original languages. So they're a really sort of slightly frustrating source. But David Amissi was one of the first people to compile those into a book and to think about using those as a historical source. And then Shantanu Das has done a lot of really finely grained work on those, looking at the text itself, almost parsing the text for the language and the vocabulary of the text, and thinking about what it tells us. And Gajendra Singh, who's at Exeter, has also written about those letters. So those particular First World War letters are very precious, and they're in the British Library. In fact, they've been digitised. You can see them online. So they've been a really good source. But I think what I was trying to stress is that the 19th century has been a little, I think generally warfare in the 19th century has been a little bit neglected, because it used to be a Victorian gung-ho subject. And a lot of social and cultural historians have kind of gone the other way. And I think what I'm trying to do is think about some of those subjects that the Victorians were very interested in writing about. There's tons of sources, but try and see them through a different lens.
Thank you very much for intriguing lecture. It's always worried me rather about what would you consider to be the role and function of the Indian princes in all this? I mean, they have often been the kind of missing link in so much historiography, which has been now actually remedied. But do you think that they play a fundamental role? I mean, they thought themselves very let down, didn't they, by the final result, because they thought they had been let down by Mountbatten and Nehru in 1947. But will you be looking at the role of the princes in all this earlier period?
I'm glad you mentioned the princes, because I didn't mention the princes. I mean, the princely states made up about a fifth of undivided subcontinent, and ruled by Maharajas and Rajas and Nawabs, and they were allowed to have their own private armies, and they loaned their armies then to the British during a lot of these campaigns. And some of them themselves became quite senior, sort of got military decorations and awards, and went to Sandhurst, for instance, in the interwar period. So they are really important. And a lot of them were doing that, I think, in a way of sort of, well, partly because of, I mean, this is where ideology becomes a bit complicated, because there is a belief. Sometimes there is a kind of loyalty and a loyalism and a belief, but also because they're gaining favour from the British and they're propping their own position. So it's partly why they feel really let down in 1947 when their states are merged into the new states of India and Pakistan. But yeah, they are really important. And those soldiers were very substantial. I mean, there's significant numbers of soldiers recruited from princely states. In fact, another plug for another student, Malvina, who did the postgraduate certificate in history and is completing a doctorate on the Indian honours system, has looked at the way that honours were granted and used as a kind of as a tool of empire, and as a way of managing exactly, yeah. Exactly, and yeah, and one of her findings, which is really fascinating, is that women were getting some of those orders, like the Begum of Bhopal, far before women in Britain were getting honours. There were women in India were being given honours by the British Raj far in advance of in Britain itself.
Excellent. So I'm going to take, I think, 3 or 4 more questions. Just before that, a very quick factual question from the online audience. Mark Smith is asking, when were rank and file British excluded from the Indian Army and the EIC Army had European regiments? Were they disbanded after the Crown displacement of the company?
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. That was a quick factual one.
You talked about the relationship between imperial defence strategy and India and the Indian taxpayer. I wondered if you could expand upon that a bit, particularly in the 19th century.
In what sense?
I think you mentioned that imperial defence strategy was built on the Indian taxpayer.
Yeah.
I wondered if you could say a bit more.
I mean, David Washbrook, who was a historian who taught me here in Oxford, called it a military fiscal despotic system or something. I mean, basically, what you see in India is that unlike some other imperial places, there's already, before the British arrive in the 18th century, there's a very large land revenue system. There's a lot of peasant cultivators who are capable of paying tax. So it's not it's not a state where the British go to get raw materials so much as to displace the ruling class and use it as a way of extracting tax. And what you can do with that then is pay for soldiers. So it's a sort of becomes like a circular system. So the company, if we go right back to the 18th century, the company in Calcutta wants to defend its own trade, and it's able then to hire soldiers, but then it needs to kind of get more of the local taxation to pay for those soldiers. So it sort of displaces the Indian landowners effectively, or kind of intercuts by then becoming at the top of the pyramid and taking that tax. So what it means is that there was already this military fiscal system, but the British are able to insert themselves into that and then to use it to take out lots of soldiers in a way that they're not able to in, say, other parts of empire in quite the same way. And it's also just a population question. It's just a big population. It's not as big as it is today, but it's by the time of independence, 350 million. So it's a really big, India's a big place.
Just the image you showed earlier at the start of the imperial procession with the Indian guy, with the Indian soldier at the back, kind of also sort of always brings to mind the possibility of the Indian and the West African that he's marching alongside actually talking to each other. And I wonder if you had any comments on the relationship of the Indian Army to West African deployment of West African troops, Indonesia, Malaya. I mean, that whole process of exchange amongst colonized peoples in the process of military service.
Yeah, it's a big question, and you can find evidence that cuts in both directions. I mean, there was certainly there's certainly some public kind of outrage about the idea of West African soldiers, for instance, coming to India during the Second World War and being stationed in places like Bengal. But at the same time, you can find evidence of really interesting solidarities, of people meeting, exchanging information, of intermarriage even, of all kinds of sort of contact zones and of cosmopolitan contact zones. The same, and that goes right back. I mean, in 1810, when troops went to Java in Indonesia today, some of them stayed, and there's quite a long history of like that Indo-Javanese relation through the earlier contact. So I think it's like, I mean, with all of these examples, it's hard to generalize because the numbers are so great and you can find different examples. But I think what I would emphasize is that the military becomes a force for kind of people coming into contact with each other, and cosmopolitanism of the sorts or kind of new contact zones. It accelerates that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jasmine. I think we'll be going to the ring, so there'll be time to speak with Yasmin there as well if you want to join us. So if you go through the fire exits just across on the other side of the square. So please join me saying a big thank you to Yasmin, please.
Thank you.